Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of the Rising Tide Leadership Podcast, where we simplify the complexities of your leadership journey. Today, we have a very special guest who has spent over 25 years transforming organizations through digital innovation, data-driven strategy, and leadership development. Charran. Eric has worked with some of the biggest names in the business, including Microsoft and Capital One, helping organizations leverage technology to drive impact. But today, we're here to talk about something every leader can relate to: how to navigate difficult workplace dynamics and become a better leader despite them. Eric's new book, entitled, and I love this, "Have You Ever Had a Boss That... And the subtitle is "Succeeding in a Dysfunctional Workplace." It dives into the different types of challenging managers that we all experience and how not just to survive, but to thrive under them. This episode is going to be packed with insights on leadership, workplace culture, and personal growth. So let's get to it. Eric, what's going on, man?
Mo, how are you? It's great to be with you today.
Yeah, it's great to have you on the show. Why don't you give my audience, before we get to the book, a little background about yourself and tell us about the journey?
Yeah, sure. What a great way to start. So I guess my journey was, I've been around for a while. I'm a Gen Xer. So I graduated my undergrad right around the dot-com bubble, which maybe most of your listeners might know, and then went to work for Microsoft, worked for a couple consulting companies, worked for Microsoft for about 18 years, spent time in the field as a deep technologist, working early in career, learning from and sometimes being shocked and horrified by different managers' behaviors. Most of the time, I was kind of happy with the managers that I had. I had some great leaders and had some great role models. But, throughout my career there and then, moving to, the other organizations I've had the pleasure of being a part of, I started to realize that so many of these behaviors that I've observed in the past seem to reoccur. And these reoccurring behaviors, I kind of categorize them as unhelpful behaviors. And the reason why I categorize them that way is because it's not necessarily the fault of the person that's exhibiting these unhelpful behaviors. And so it's very easy, and especially early in career when I started encountering these things, to kind of just be like, that person is terrible. Who would lead that way? Who would say these things?
Right.
But in reality, it took me a while to figure this out. But my son is an amazing student athlete. And when I was watching one of his football practices, the whole, technique that many coaches use, which is say, hey, if you goof up, the entire team takes a lap, right? And I think we now know that that's a perfect example of coaches coach how they were coached. And I've kind of like thinking about this and saying that leaders lead how they were led, meaning that these are the only tools in the toolboxes that they have. If there were different tools in there, I'm sure they would use them. Or if they knew those tools were wrong, I'm sure they would switch tools. But in many instances, they don't have that awareness, that knowledge, or that experience. They can only go from, well, now that I'm here in this management position, I know what my manager did to me or how they led me. So I'm going to do the same thing because they were successful and they've moved on and now I'm here and I want to be successful. These are what I use. And so as I began talking with a couple of colleagues, and then we slowly realized that, hey, not only did some of these behaviors remanifest across different people, but they started, like other people have started to encounter these exact same archetypical behaviors as well. And so that was an aha moment, and somebody said, hey, somebody should write this down. And so I said, all right, I'll write it down. And that's the genesis of the book.
Yeah, that's great. You've worked, like we mentioned, for Microsoft, Capital One, some of the big dogs. What are some leadership lessons that you've learned along the way?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is self-awareness is key. It's the ability for you to basically take a step back and say, how am I leading? How am I showing up? How does my team want to be led? Am I overutilizing one tool in favor of another one? Do I need to invest in myself? Do I exhibit some of these challenging behaviors myself that I am encountering with my leadership and my management? And I think that that's probably one of the biggest things, which is self-awareness and the ability to, with humility, accept recommendations. And feedback, I think, is a negative word. I like to use perspectives. Feedback is a neutral word, but here in corporate speak, feedback means you're not doing something right? And so different perspectives, I think, actually help out a lot. And you have to be able to accept those things with humility. I'm a big fan of servant leadership. During the leadership change around 2014 at Microsoft, I got to see that firsthand. when our chief executive officer, Satya Nadella, took over, and he was all about resetting the culture, going from know-it-alls to learn-it-alls to servant leadership, and he demoed that every day for us. So it was a really great set of lessons that I learned there.
So let's get right to the book, and I'd like to get a little bit of the story behind the book. You mentioned what has inspired you and inspired your philosophy. Here's my first question, and this is what I was thinking when I was reading the book. What was the hardest part about writing this book? Like, did you ever feel like you had to hold back certain insights? Because it seemed to me like you could probably put a name or a face to each of these archetypes that you were talking about.
So I didn't have to hold back on insights. I did have to hold back on details and protecting the innocent, right? So all the stories that are in this book are things that have happened to me and that I've actually kind of pressure tested with my peers. And they're like, yep, they happened to me too. Or yep, that's definitely one.
Yeah.
I've encountered 5 people that are like that. And so, and then again, as I started exploring this with a couple of experts and some folks that are in the industry with me, they're like, this is exactly the right archetype to put in the book. The biggest, I guess, revelation is that little self-awareness. So as I'm the book in many instances wrote itself. And I know a lot of authors say that, and people may groan when they hear that, but because came from such a personal, professional set of experiences, I kind of just poured it all out. And the way that I structured it is I didn't want it to be like a typical like business help book in which it says, here's the things you should do, here's the academic research to back it up, and then go do it. I wanted it to feel to the reader more like, yes, I've been there. I've been in a situation where a manager schedules a 7:30 a.m. meeting, and I've got my kids in the back seat. I'm trying to get off the train. I'm spilling coffee. And this is the only time of day that they could get together and ask me about things that I already told them last week, right? So these things actually happened, and I started to write about them in a narrative way. So I introduced the chapters with narration or with a story ripped from real life. And then I talk about how we can understand why the person is exhibiting those unhelpful behaviors so that we can emote with them, and then what to do to kind of survive that behavior and then eventually thrive in that setting where you can grow your manager.
Eric, you outlined several difficult boss archetypes in this book: the surprise, the emergency broadcaster, the complainer, and much more. Which one do you think is most common in the workplace today?
That's a good one. I don't know if I can say which one's most common. And what's interesting is some of these behaviors can actually coexist within the same person, within the same manager. And so it's very difficult for me to identify or to count like commonality. But one of the things I would say is that managers are under incredible load. They are under incredible mental strain. They're under incredible demand for time, effort, energy, with never the right amount of resources to get the job done that they need, whether that be budget, whether that be team members. You're always behind the 8 ball, but you're always being instrumented on delivering standout, fantastic results. And as a result of that, there are lots of different archetypical behaviors that crop up in service of those demands that are placed on these managers. Some of the more common ones I've seen have been kind of like this one called, it's the amnesiac, which is these managers are under such intense mental load that information doesn't go from short-term memory to long-term memory. It just stays in short-term memory, and it's like they're kicking the ball back down out of the goal, right?
Right.
And they're just trying to just push it back downfield as much as possible because it's their belief that quick, functional, decisions made in the moment are going to bat that ball back across the net and then leave you more time to actually think about what it is that you want to do. But it just keeps coming. And so you might be like, hey, we're going into a meeting. And I think I write about this in the book. We're going into a meeting. I want to make sure that you're on board with all of the work that we've done. We've been working on this proposal for the last 2 weeks. We got to convince the CXO that this is the right thing to do. Need your support at these points here. Wanted to get this in front of you the day before the meeting. And then you show up to the meeting and your manager is the person that's, firing the shots. They're like, who thought that this project was going to be a good idea? What kind of value we're getting out of this?
Absolutely.
And how long have you guys been working on this? And, all that kind of stuff. And you're just like, not only have I been working on this for weeks, but the team has prepared you well in advance. Positions, it never made it to ROM, right? It was in RAM. And then, you shut down at the end of the day. It all gets emptied out. It never made it to that permanent storage in which they can be like, oh, now I remember. And so I have some coping strategies on how to deal with that. But to me, that's what I've seen the most, which is people taking in information and persisting it in long-term storage and keeping that context.
Which archetype do you think is the most dangerous to a company's culture, and why?
Early in career, I encountered what I term the firefighter manager, which is it's a archetype that really focuses on drawing energy from emergencies. And to the point where this manager deems their whole value add to the organization is when emergencies come up, you call this manager in and they will put out the fire. They'll make sure everybody's safe. The organization will be back on its four wheels and then we'll start rolling again. Why I think that this is dangerous is it's exciting actually working underneath that type of manager for the first few times. You're woken up in the middle of the night, money has stopped moving, systems are down, whatever it might be, and you are there on the front lines actually, trying to resolve this problem. And afterwards you get this rush of what an awesome job we did. Until it happens, that maybe lasts for like the first 2 to 3 times. And then it happens a fourth time and a fifth time and a sixth time for the same reason. And eventually you're like, okay, this has lost its luster now. The only person that's not super excited and jazzed up when an emergency happens is the firefighter manager who loves that. And they're kind of reinforced by the organization because the CEO is coming down the hall saying, great job, everybody. High five. Thanks for staying up. Thanks for waking up at 2 a.m. and getting the pumps moving again. And that's reinforcing for that manager. But eventually what's going to happen is the organization will grow. And the specter of fires means that every time that there's a burning fire somewhere, it's going to leave fire damage. And that fire damage could be, extreme cost, burnout of employees, just brittle and fragile business processes, things that make the organization challenging in terms of being able to grow. And so the idea behind this, what we really want to have happen here is we want to make sure that the firefighter manager gets their dopamine hit from another source. So instead of putting out fires and having this fire damage, a new CEO, growth CEO will come in and be like, hey, heard everybody was up late last night. Hope everybody's okay. Thanks for taking care of that. How do we prevent this from happening again? And in that moment, in my experience, you can see the firefighter manager's face kind of crack. Like, what are you talking about? Like, this is what I do. I put out fires.
Right.
And in reality, the winds are shifting, right? And that's where you can come in and say, hey, how about a days without incident count? Maybe that's how we get the dopamine, right? Like, that's how we figure things out.
One of my favorite sayings is, as leaders, we put out fires. I love your perspective that once we put out the fire, we have to figure out, where did that come from? How do we stop this from happening again? Because we shouldn't be putting out fires on the same figurative building. We should figure out how to do that. What's one of the most unexpected lessons that you've learned about leadership from observing these different managerial styles?
I think what's most unexpected is kind of the realization I had after I was all done writing the book, which was, and I mentioned it at the top of our time together. These people it's important for us to separate the behavior from the individual. I think if the individuals knew how their behaviors and their tools and their toolboxes were impacting and affecting not only the team underneath them, but it's limiting their growth as well and the growth of the organization and their team's goals, they would say, well, of course, if I had an alternative, I wouldn't do that. And that realization hit me because it helped me because I knew that the correct path to kind of developing these coping strategies and implementing them is identifying and putting yourself in that manager's shoes to understand why they might be exhibiting these behaviors, to not take them personally. And that was really challenging because in many instances, especially early in career, I felt like these things were being done to me deliberately by these individuals that just had a problem with who I was or how I looked or the color of my tie on Thursday. Whatever the reason was, I felt it was me. But if you get down to the core of it, I'm not saying, by the way, that toxic relationships like that don't exist. But in my experience, the real reason was they were just using hammers when they're trying to screw in screws. And that realization kind of led me to really help develop the specter of coping and thriving for each of these archetypes. And the core of that is that emotional intelligence, that empathizing with the manager. And then you can actually not go down that jaded spiral that we all get into, which is like, oh, gosh, I hate this place. You wake up
Yep.
before your phone alarm goes off in the morning. You're like, oh man, it's Monday. I thought it was Sunday. You get to get
Absolutely.
off that bicycle or that cycle and really take control of your destiny, so to speak. You feel empowered because there are things that now that you can do because you're not subject to it. You're not being victimized by it necessarily.
Eric, let's talk about strategies for thriving under difficult leaders. One of my favorite books is called Leading Up by an author named Michael UC. I read it first late in the 80s when it came out, and it has been on my shelf ever since. I take my clients through it. I take young people through it. You talk about leading up in your book. How do you influence a difficult boss without stepping on his or her toes?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's empathizing with them and understanding what it's like to be in their shoes, the mental load they're under, the tools that they might have in their toolbox. All of that, having said all of that, what I think really is important is how can you be of service to somebody like this? How can you make their lives easier? Because ultimately, it feels so counterintuitive if you're being stung by these unhelpful behaviors. Just the injustice of experiencing a manager that just destroys you in a meeting, even though you try to take all the right steps to prepare them so that they could support you. It's difficult to you got to process that emotion. And then you have to say, well, this was not done to me. It's not personal. Again, it may be in certain circumstances, but the majority of what I've experienced is that it's not personal. It's just they've got a screwdriver and they need to hammer in a nail. And then figuring out, well, hey, not only do I have advice for you on how not to do that, but here's how I can help you not do that. Here's how I can help you understand in advance of a meeting, even though I prepared you, I need you to remember these things. And I want to make sure you remember them. So I'm going to change how I interact with you because it's going to be important for us to achieve our goals. So I think a lot of people in the professional world remember what you've done for them, which is I tell folks that I manage, which is if you want to be a servant to somebody and you want to kind of influence somebody, just answer the question, what have you done for me lately? Meaning that's what they're going to ask about you. And
Wow.
so if you can say, hey, I did this for you, together we achieve these benefits, that really is the starting point for kind of trying to manage some of these more difficult behaviors and thrive underneath them.
Man, that's a great leadership lesson. I'm gonna take that one. Eric, one of the biggest workplace struggles is feeling powerless under bad leadership. What's one of the mindset shifts that you would recommend for somebody who's feeling stuck?
Yeah. The big ones are, and you can only go through this after you process the emotion. I feel like if you try to take the shortcut, eventually it's going to come out. So definitely feel the feelings and recognize them and give them place. After that, and that's a continuous journey. I don't want to trivialize that part of it. But while that's going on, maybe was what I should say. There is a saying, and I don't know where it came from. I heard it from one of my managers. It's Q-tip, which is quit taking it personal. Everyone's probably heard of that one, which is, again, it's difficult to do. But once you disconnect the fact that this is not personal, it's not being done to me, and then you realize that these behaviors, they thrive in silence, right? They expect, and many people expect that, hey, I just got to suffer through this, and if I complain, I'm going to be seen as a complainer, and I don't want to be a complainer because that could hurt my career chances, and I certainly don't want to do that, so I'll just suffer underneath it and, do my best. I think the mindset should be Q-tip, quit taking it personal. And the second thing I would say is know your worth. Because as much as folks like me and other individuals write what helped us through these things, there's going to be certain circumstances where all the advice in the world or all the tactics or techniques or strategies in the world are not going to help. And if it is personal, or if it's just not worth your energy anymore, you have to know your worth so that you can say, you know what? I'm going to leave. I think I had a chance to spend some time with Satya while he was at Microsoft and while I was there. And he used to say, hey, people don't quit teams or organizations, they quit managers. And in certain circumstances, you might have to say, I tried my best. I tried all this advice. I know my worth. I'm going somewhere else. And to me, that ultimately is the type of mindset that you have. You are worth something. Other organizations or other teams or other managers are going to find you worthy. You're not stuck. Even though you might think that this person holds your economic future, your career future in their hand, they do to a certain extent, but you're not necessarily bound and covered by that realization.
What was the most fun chapter that you wrote in the book? What's your favorite one?
Oh gosh, well, the whole thing was fun, but maybe the most cathartic one that kind of poured out was the LIFO, which is the last in, first out manager archetype.
Yeah.
So the LIFO is one in which the last thing that this manager hears from their constituents, right, their people, their managers, their C-level, the C-suite, whatever it is, the last thing that they were asked is the first thing that gets done by the team, regardless of what the team is already working on. Regardless of what the team already believed was an important priority, that to me was the most fun to work on, because it was the most challenging for me personally to deal with.
How do you help a leader that you are under stay consistent with priorities, stick to the projects that are started, and stay away from confusion?
Yeah, it depends on several things. You have to identify the unhelpful behavior or the archetype itself. You then have to figure out the right way to really connect with this manager. So it's empathizing with the manager's circumstances. It's understanding what their perspectives are, understanding what they have to kind of ladder up to and deal with. And then it's being able to figure out, well, if my manager and I were equals and we were working on the same team together, what would they do? What would I do to support them? How would we move ourselves toward this goal? And then it's trying to figure out, well, what is the propensity of my manager to actually accept this advice? If I charge into their office and I start talking about all of the right things to do with data and all the research that we did, I used to tell my teams that, hey, being right is only like 50% of the battle. And in fact, the other 50% is getting the person to be in the mindset to listen to you. And what I realized maybe mid in career is that people don't necessarily make logical decisions. They make emotional decisions, and then they seek logic to back it up. And the more data you throw at them, the more they are going to get entrenched in that emotion and less willing to listen to you. So my belief is you have to identify the archetype, identify the behavior, understand the motivations, understand what it's like to walk in their shoes. And then first, before throwing the right answer at them, get them into a position where they have to listen. So, or they're willing to listen. So you could say things like, it must be really difficult having to deal with all these different priorities. I can't believe that, the CMO asked you to do this additional stuff without giving us resources. That's got to be a challenge. I wonder if there's a way for us to deal with this. Do you have any ideas? Because I have a few, but only if you're willing to listen. If you're not in a space to listen, I can go write them down and I can come back and we can kind of brainstorm later. So it's that emotional intelligence that really requires the ability for you to feel the person out. Are they willing to listen to different perspectives, alternate perspectives, or even criticisms? Some of them are not. Some of them are highly uncomfortable with being criticized. And so getting that emotional intelligence foundation is what's really important.
For those listening who are in leadership positions themselves, how can they make sure that they don't become one of these difficult bosses?
I think I said it at the top, right? I think we were talking about self-awareness as being critical, but that's difficult to do, especially when you're under the pressures that modern leaders are under. The biggest challenge is you gotta deliver results. Those results have to be measurable. Then you have to manage your team. You have to make sure your team is happy and satisfied, and you have to grow individuals on your team. You have to do succession planning. Many people listening might be like, woe is me, we all have to do these things, but that doesn't diminish the mental load that places on an individual. And so self-awareness and leadership growth and filling your toolbox with the right tools often falls to the bottom of that list. And so again, you resort back to your survival skills, which is, what are the things that my other managers are doing? And so very, very few leaders, I think, and based on my experience, spend the time to go and say, you know what, I need to go get some leadership training. I need to go figure out how I should lead. In certain organizations, like I was involved in a special program at Microsoft for high performers, they actually kind of say, hey, I want you to be part of this hypo program. You need to be brought in, and we're going to give you leadership training. We're going to teach you identify personality traits and how to work with these different individuals. And after attending a couple of years of that, I'm like, this is fantastic, but everybody needs this. And of course, follow the money. It's probably pretty expensive to get people that training. But at the same time, that's really the best place to put that. It's not necessarily in executive leadership, although that's important because these people are managing, hundreds of, thousands of people sometimes. But middle managers, first-time managers, giving them that backdrop is going to be super important. So my perspective is try to be as self-aware as possible. if you imagine the way in which you're kind of typing an email, or you're, sending a Slack message, or you're delivering a message in an all hands meeting, pretend you were just hearing that as a listener. Pretend you are consuming this message. And that might help you unravel how to kind of unlock self-awareness if it's not something that you're naturally good at practicing. And then figure out, and what's a way that I can actually get feedback from my teams, and I can accept them with humility, and to create this place of like psychological safety where people can be honest with me without retribution. Like I said, I've been around for a while. Concepts like psychological safety and belongingness and bringing your whole self to work didn't exist when I got started, but they're here now. And effective leaders have to be able to practice those things.
Yeah, when I hear that, I think about Abraham Lincoln. When he used to get upset with somebody, he would write a scathing letter, but he would never send it out. He would just put it in his desk drawer and just say, that one's for me. And I guess when he passed away, they found a bunch of letters that never went out. We all need to avoid falling into negative leadership traps. What's some advice that you would give somebody that says, I'm not a self-aware person, I need to start with something very practical? Eric, what can I do tomorrow?
Gosh, it's a multifaceted answer. However you communicate, imagine you're the person receiving that communication. Are you feeling inspired by what was said? If it's a tough message, did you receive the tough message, but did you know it was coming from somebody that has your best interest at heart? Was it a message that had sparse details? Is it one in which people were like, did it sow more confusion than it did clarity?
Right.
I think one of the things I learned is that, managers do two things. They establish culture and they control resources. And so with that lens, you really have to think about, what is the culture I'm establishing? And culture is difficult to even define, let alone try to, somehow orchestrate and establish. But just begin by thinking, if I was being managed by me, what would I say? How would I receive what was being sent out? And then ask for feedback, ask for perspectives. And again, whether you call it feedback or perspectives, I think you should accept those with humility and authenticity, and get people to try to provide it as authentically as possible, sometimes even anonymously. Now, a lot of organizations have these pulse surveys which go out every year, and lots of managers feel ambushed by those, which is like your pulse survey, which is basically your survey. For those that don't know, the pulse survey is like, how good a job is your manager doing? And sometimes, and by the way, these surveys have real impact into how managers are compensated and looked at for promotion. So they do matter, by the way. But sometimes managers get ambushed by these things. Don't let it be a surprise. Manage that surprise all year long. Every interaction, every one-on-one, every skip level with people that are in your organization. Get their pulse, and then see if you can summarize what their feedback is, and then be purposeful about telling people what you've heard and what you plan to do, and then actually go ahead and do it.
Speaking of feedback and perspective, Eric, you're a very self-aware person. How did you get there? Who are the men and women who have spoken into your life, and how did you come into contact with them? How did you ask them? How did those relationships come to be?
That's a great question. It sounds so anticlimactic to answer you with by accident, but largely, I would love to tell you that, hey, I am super self-aware, but a self-aware person would never admit that they're self-aware, right? So because there's always room to improve. So right. there's that trap in that question. Not that you intentionally trap me. But the second thing is, I would love to say, hey, Mo, you know what? I spent a lot of time reflecting, and I sought out leaders, and I sought out mentors, and I got advice from people that I really admired. I didn't do any of that. It was all by accident. It was all me certainly trying to look after my own career velocity, and certainly finding people that I thought I could work with, and we could have great results in the organization. They could amplify my own career aspirations and my own work products and my own aspirations for the organization. And then as I started to work with these people, it became really evident that I wanted to start to emulate some of their great behavior, because the way that they did communicate with me, the way that they did support me in meetings, the way that it felt like we were a team, that was what gave me energy. And as I was experiencing some of these other archetypes in certain aspects of my professional life, I'm like, these are the things that take away my energy, and they sap the energy. So I'd love to tell you that it was purposeful, that I sought these things out. I didn't, but that's not to say, for listeners, you should absolutely do that. Don't be like me. Find leaders that you admire, find people that you want to work with, align yourself with them. If it's an informal mentorship kind of conversation, I think mentorship is a scary word because it means calendar invites and time commitments and responsibilities and stuff. Just ask people questions. Just interact with them and say, hey, I need some advice, and start small.
Eric, your book isn't just about coping with bad bosses. It's also about personal growth. What's one leadership habit that you'd recommend for every leader to start developing today?
I think empathy is a fantastic leadership habit. And maybe I'll give like maybe one example. So earlier in my leadership journey, I used to ask for feedback and perspectives. And when I didn't get any, I was like, this is fantastic. I must be doing an awesome job. And I used to do this on all hands meetings. Anybody have any questions or Zoom meetings? Raise your hand and, let me know if you don't like what I'm doing, or does anybody have any thoughts on this? What I didn't realize at the time was that there are different people. People are different than me, right? In fact, I made the mistake once of hiring a team of people that were exactly like me. Because I thought, like what every, manager thinks is like, oh, I just need people that think, act, and talk like me. Man, that would be awesome. And in reality, if you all have the same strengths, you all have the same weaknesses and the same blind spots. So I learned quickly from that to hire diverse people with diverse perspectives, people that deliberately weren't like me, but were equally talented, or maybe not more, if not more talented. And in doing that, I learned that sometimes people are not comfortable giving feedback in front of a group, especially if it's critical of a manager or somebody that's in a more senior position in the organization. By the way, my last role was global. So not only is it, dealing with people in the US, with the US culture, which is typically more gregarious, outgoing, confrontational, more extroverted, there are other cultures around the world from different countries where that is just never done. It's an anathema, right? And so realizing that is super important. Like, so that was maybe just one core example of empathizing with a person that's like, I come from a culture, or maybe I'm just introverted and I'm just not comfortable airing grievances, complaining, or criticizing a manager in front of the entire division or the entire organization. And that was something that I started noticing. I started noticing after the session, I would get Slack messages, emails, like, hey, you asked for my feedback, here it is. And I'm like, why didn't you just bring this up in front of everybody? Because it would have been valuable for everybody to hear. And they either didn't answer me, and I'm like, well, maybe there's a reason. And the reason is because they're not comfortable. And I said to them, I said to the individual in a one-on-one, how uncomfortable do I make it for people when I ask for feedback? And they're like, extremely uncomfortable. And I don't want to be called out in front of everybody, complaining, criticizing you. And I said, thank you very much for that. That was a lesson.
What's one key lesson from the book that somebody might miss if they were just skimming through it way too fast?
I think that there is a power in leveraging the crowd. So in certain circumstances, managers are very difficult to influence, and you might feel that you're alone in trying to change their mind, even if you're employing all the techniques of empathy and trying to be of service and answering the "what have I done for you lately" question, or making this person's job easier. And you might be at a dead end. And I think in one of the books, coping strategies, I list, and I actually provide an example of how the individual can actually leverage the peer group of your manager to try to help affect change. So in this example in the book, there was a issue in which I call it the raw nerve archetype. So the raw nerve is somebody that disregards data and makes decisions just like that because maybe in their history, that's what they needed: quick decision making, not a lot of information, move fast and break things. But organizations reach a point where you actually need to have data-backed discovery. You need to have alternatives measured. And so the example I give in the book was a team that was working for maybe like a couple months on trying to find out like what the new cloud analytics platform was. And in the unveiling of this research, the manager comes in and says, I read this thing on Reddit last night. This product is getting trashed. I don't think we should go with it. And the person in the book is like, oh my goodness, holy cow, that's not absolutely terrible. And the coping strategy I kind of wrote about in the book was, hey, if our team is responsible for selecting the cloud platform, and we have an individual that is just making a snap judgment based on something they read on Reddit, then it's my job to go and talk to the constituents to say, hey, we've got a bunch of data that will help make the right decision for the organization. We have a perspective from this person, but I want to make sure that you're aware that we are actually developing a lot of data underneath it to either corroborate that perspective or to kind of just say, hey, maybe we need to take a pause on that. And so by leveraging the power of the cloud, the constituent, the person that's going to view the cloud platform is like, yeah, I want to make a data back decision. I don't care what this person read on Reddit, but you have to do it in a way in which you're not paddling on that manager. And I talk about how to do that in the book.
One of my favorite questions to ask to authors is, what's one book that has made a significant impact on your journey as a leader?
I think the one book that made a significant impact on my journey is The Growth Mindset by Carol Dweck. And this was actually not a book that I sought out at all. In fact, it was given to senior leaders at Microsoft during the change of the CEO in 2014 when Satya was trying to reset the culture. And the book came to my house, and I looked at it, read the front and back, and I was like, I'm Eric Charran. Of course I have a growth mindset. And I put that book on my table, and it sat there for maybe about 4 months. And then I ended up having a meeting with some senior executives, and it was a cultural retreat. And they're like, make sure you've read the book because he will ask questions about this. And I'm like, oh, rats. So on the plane, I'm reading the book, and I get through page 10, through page 20. I'm like, oh my gosh, this thing has changed my life. And it really did. Within the first 20 pages, I was like, I am all these things that are bad. I need to fix myself in these ways. And so that was really a hugely impactful book. And it affected not only how I navigate my professional life, but even my personal life and raising my kids. Instead of saying like, hey, look how smart you are, I'll say things like, look how hard you are instead. And that really was impactful and fundamental in both professional and personal circles for me.
What I took away from the book is a couple of things, and let's see if I'm on the right track here. That leadership isn't just about leading those below you, but it's also about managing up, navigating dysfunction, taking ownership of my own personal growth. Am I on the right track?
You got it 100%. It's finding ways to realize that you are not subject to these behaviors. You don't have to suffer in silence with them. You can actually separate yourself from the very, very real, visceral, emotional reactions. And then you can start taking control of the situation by emoting with your manager, understanding your manager, and then making suggestions, getting them to a place where they're willing to listen to your suggestions, being of service to not only the manager, but to the team and to the organization, and then knowing your worth. When you put in that time and you put in these efforts, and it's just not working out, and you're no longer willing to expend your time and energy in this way, being able to say, it's time to go. It's time for me to find someplace else and not run from something, but run towards something. I think those are the big things that I've learned.
Eric, what would your final thoughts be regarding this book and anybody who is on the leadership journey, no matter how high or low?
Yeah, that's a heavy question. I would say that maybe two things. The first is these behaviors persist in silence. When you just suffer through them and you are subject to them and you're just kind of just trying to endure, they are just going to continue for you and people that come after you. The other thing I would say is the closest thing that human beings have to magic, I think, is confidence and creativity. So if you can kind of lean into those things, and confidence is kind of like a weird thing. People that don't have it are like, well, how do I get it? And people that have it are like, hey, I've always had it because I just faked it until I made it. Somewhere in the middle of those two extremes is really how you can kind of manifest it. But have the confidence to assume that your manager is just trying to figure it out just like you are. And that you're both on a journey and that you can't vilify them. The behaviors are separate from the people. It's just the wrong tools in the toolbox. And so if you can work together to fill the toolbox with the right tools, everybody wins.
Eric, who else that you know would the Rising Tide community benefit from hearing?
Most of my experiences have been with some really impactful leaders. This is like, I guess this is kind of like trying to pick your favorite child, right? So, but people that spring to mind for me, and with the forgiveness of excluding many of the amazing leaders I've worked with. There's an individual who I'm working with now. His name is DP Breifel. Really inspiring person. Worked with him in my early days at Microsoft. Have the pleasure of working with him continue. Work for some of the world's biggest organizations. Really, really great leader. Really inspiring leader. Very inclusive. Masterful communicator. All of the things that I aspired to be when I was early in career. Great person to meet and chat with.
That'd be wonderful. Eric, before we go, where can my audience get your book, which we will put in the show notes, and how can they connect with you?
Yeah, great question. So the book is going to be available on Amazon and all of its associated bookstores around the world. You can get it on Google Books. Just search for "Have You Ever Had a Boss That?" You can put my name in there. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn. Just search for Eric Charran. That's a Charran. On social, on Instagram, I'm author Eric Charran. And same thing on TikTok for as long as that's going to be around.
Yeah, we'll see, right? Well, for my audience, make sure you pick up the book. Again, it's called "Have You Ever Had a Boss That?" Subtitle: Succeeding in a Dysfunctional Workplace. Eric, it's been wonderful having you share about the book. I cannot say enough good words about it. I loved it. Leaders, you got to read this book. I can't plug it enough. Don't forget to subscribe to the Rising Tide Leadership Podcast so you don't miss anything. And Eric, it's been great to have you on the show, and I hope that we get to have you back on again for your next book, which I hope you're writing right now.
Thanks for having me on, Mo. It's been great being here.
And for my audience, lead well. We'll see you next time.